Welcome back. Okay, this is part 3 of chapter 6. We're talking all about television. Hopefully you've seen the first 2 parts. This part, we're going to be talking about different forms of TV entertainment. And then we're going to circle back a little bit to the economics of television. But I have attached several links, not just here in the PowerPoint that you can use, but I'll actually separately put them in the Canvas shell in that, obviously, that first weekly task that you go through so that you can follow along. My suggestion here is as we talk about this, I will prompt you to maybe look at the actual clip, and then we'll resume. And you can kind of you can have 2 windows open at once if you want to do it that way. I would love to play them for you live, but unfortunately, I know for a fact that YouTube, once I load this up, if I were to load these up here, would take them down for copyright. I keep getting slapped on the wrist, so I don't want to do that anymore. So we're just going to watch them on kind of, you're kind of on your own to watch them. But in any event, just to refresh your memory real quick, television programming began by borrowing genres from radio, which included variety shows, sitcoms, soap operas, and newscasts. And secondly, by 1955, networks moved to Los Angeles from New York to Los Angeles, where LA has now really become kind of the entertainment capital of the world. Certainly, film, I think, came over first, and then you had LA. I should say film came to LA first, then television came to LA. Another thing you might want to know is that kinescopes were used to preserve live broadcasts early on. What that was basically a camera that was aimed at, believe it or not, a TV monitor that to make a recording. And so a lot of the early shows, not very well preserved because of this, but one of those that was I Love Lucy, which was shot on film. But anyway, we'll get into that in just a moment. In any event, early shows imitated vaudeville and stage performances, right? So very much you see things that were really kind of started in radio that sort of translate over to television, and then television starts to branch out and start doing its own thing. So sketch comedies, right, which imitated vaudeville and stage performances, were very popular early on. This was basically, I think, the book talks about a sketch comedy, or I read this somewhere, that, if you watch, say, for example, Jimmy Fallon, right? That's a modern example. And every now and then they would do these sketch comedies. And that's what was really kind of very popular, at least in the early to mid 50s in television, if you were to go back and actually turn your TV on at that point. Next up is the situation comedy, or sitcom, which features a recurring cast, each episode a narrative situation. And the example there on that link, which is basically I Love Lucy, but essentially in many sitcoms, character development is downplayed in favor of zany plots. Characters are usually static and predictable. They generally do not develop much during the course of a series. And much like viewers of soap operas, sitcom fans feel just a little bit smarter than the characters, whose lives seem wacky and out of control. All right. And so obviously the one that everybody talks about, the one that really kind of put this on the map, was I Love Lucy. From 1951 to 57, Lucille Ball, Desi Arnaz began the show near their home in Southern California. It was also filmed before a live television audience and shot on film, because videotape was not created, by the way, until 1956. That's why the kinescope was so crucial for the early to mostly for most of the series of I Love Lucy. Anyway, it led to, this show actually led to 2 formats, sketch comedy and situation comedy, right? And we talked about the fact of what a situation comedy is. And we also talked a little bit about what a sketch comedy is. But on that link, I want you to look at it. It's very cool. It's a scene in which, in fact, it's kind of a metaphor for life in a way. It's basically Lucille Ball and her sidekick essentially trying to manage to package chocolates on a conveyor belt. And The belt bringing out the chocolates goes quicker and quicker and quicker, and it's very. I mean, Lucille Ball's comedic timing is amazing, and the crazy thing is that show, I Love Lucy, is still in syndication. We'll talk a little more about syndication here coming up. Still in syndication today, and really was the first show to be syndicated, and that was because of Desi Arnaz. So it has I mean, read up on I Love Lucy if you want. Just Google I Love Lucy and read up on all the different things about it. But it really was, one of the most important shows in our culture, in TV culture history, no doubt about it. All right. Well, the other form of comedy is called domestic comedy, where the characters and settings are typically more important than complicated predicaments. Although an episode might offer a goofy situation as a subplot, the main narrative usually features a personal problem or family crisis the characters have to resolve. We've seen this come up over and over again. Greater emphasis is placed on character development than on reestablishing the order that has been disrupted by confusion. So this basically starts in the 50s, but to give you some modern examples, Parks and Recreation, Curb Your Enthusiasm, Shameless, which was this longtime show on Showtime, also falls into this category. And the link that I have here, I believe, is to an article on Schitt's Creek, not SHIT, but SCHITTS, which was a Canadian television sitcom created by Dan Levy and his father, Eugene. It aired on CBC television from 2015 to 2020, so Canadian television. Later, Netflix picked it up. It consists of 80 episodes over 6 seasons, and basically, the series followed the formerly wealthy Rose family's trials and tribulations. After the business manager embezzles the family business, the Rose Video, the family loses its fortune, relocates to Schitt's Creek, a small town they purchased as a joke. So it has led to several Emmy Awards. Let me see if I have a number for you here. The series has won 2 Screen Actors Guilds Awards, 19 Primetime Emmy Award nominations, including Outstanding Comedy Series twice. For its portrayal of LGBTQ plus people, the series received 3 nominations for a GLAAD Media Award for Outstanding Comedy Series, winning twice. And at the 72nd Primetime Emmy Awards, the series' final season swept all 7 major comedy awards. It was the first time for a comedy or drama series to receive all 7 awards. So a substantial film. I'm sorry, I just bumped that. You got a preview. Okay, in any event, that is Schitt's Creek, and that is a great example of a domestic comedy. Next up was anthology drama, okay? In the early 50s, television, like cable, in the early 80s, served a more elite and wealthier audience. Anthology dramas brought live dramatic theater to that audience. Influenced by stage plays, anthologies offered new artistically significant teleplays, cast, directors, writers, and sets from one week to the next. In the 1952-53 season alone, there were 18 anthology dramas, including Alfred Hitchcock Presents, The Twilight Zone, Kraft Television Theater, which, believe it or not, was created and introduced Kraft's Cheese Whiz. The anthology's brief run as a dramatic staple on television ended for both economic and political reasons. First, advertisers disliked anthologies because they often presented stories containing complex human problems that were not easily resolved. We love resolution in our television and our stories. The commercials that interrupted the drama, however, told upbeat stories in which problems were easily solved by purchasing a product. By contrast, anthologies made the simplicity of the commercial pitch ring false. A second reason for the demise of anthology dramas was a change in audience. The people who could afford TV sets in the early 50s could also afford tickets to a play. And eventually, we see the demographic shift of who was watching television. And you had people that began to, as television really develops into a much more widespread mass medium, you really see that people kind of start to steer away from it. Finally, anthology dramas were expensive to produce, double the cost of most other TV genres in the 1950s, because each week meant a new storyline, along with new writers, casts, and sets. Sponsors and networks came to realize it would be easier and less expensive to build audience allegiance with an ongoing program featuring the same cast and set. So that's why you don't see many of them on TV today. Oh gosh, there's one on Netflix that's really good. It's a completely new set. HBO, by the way, did something similar, but on a series level. True Detective, if you've ever seen the series True Detective, I think there's like 3 seasons of that, and the actors have changed in each of the 3. So anyway, that has the kind of the hint of anthology drama. We also have the episodic series, right? Which really, I think, is now the mainstay of modern television, abandoning anthologies. Producers and writers increasingly developed episodic series. First used on radio in 1929, in this format, main characters continue from week to week, sets and locales remain the same, and technical crews stay with the program. The episodic series comes in 2 general types: chapter shows and serial programs. Chapter shows are self-contained stories with a recurring set of main characters who confront a problem, face a series of conflicts, and find a resolution. Like CSI, great example. I think the CSI shows. I think you could even say The Blacklist, but I think we'll get into more of the hybrid here in a second. Hawaii Five-0 was famous for that. There was a lot of shows over decades that basically would same actors, same type of story, resolution, start with a problem, resolve it, but maybe continue a smattering of it from one episode to the next. And then, of course, you had soap operas, right? Which is a serial program, which are open-ended episodic shows. Most storylines continue from episode to episode, cheaper to produce than chapter shows rather. Employing just a few indoor sets and running 5 days a week. Daytime soap operas were extremely popular for decades. Well, now you take the idea of a chapter show, you take the idea of a serial program, you put it into a pot, and what comes out? Well, that is the hybrid, which is what we watch mostly as consumers. Now, that hybrid link will take you to a scene from arguably one of the greatest series ever made called Breaking Bad. Maybe you've seen it. If you have not seen it, I would highly suggest watching Better Call Saul first, because that is the prequel to Breaking Bad, and a lot of these same characters that are in Better Call Saul wind up being a part of Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad was first, though. It was on the air from 2008 to 2013, 5 seasons, 62 episodes. It was set and filmed in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And if you don't know much about it, its lead actor was Bryan Cranston, who played the amazing character, iconic character, Walter White, who basically starts out as this sort of cancer-ridden, meek high school science teacher into a drug kingpin. And that show was just phenomenal in terms of its storytelling. It's provocative and unsettling at times, plot twists and where it went. One of the things in that second link, by the way, that Bryan Cranston talks about, because he had come from Malcolm in the Middle, he'd come from a sitcom, guys, and then became this iconic character on Breaking Bad. But he sat down with Dan Patrick, who's a sports talk guy, and talked about how Breaking Bad doesn't get made as a hybrid show if not for another famous series that was on HBO that absolutely was unbelievable, called The Sopranos. So if you've never seen The Sopranos, that really, I think, honestly laid the foundation for every single favorite series that you watch today, whether it be on television or on Netflix or any kind of other streaming platform. You can just talk about, and HBO obviously was what it was running on. And HBO, of course, was known for The Sopranos, The Wire, Game of Thrones, Westworld. it just goes on and on and on. Just tremendous programming. But again, one of the top ones of all time is Breaking Bad. Please watch those two links. And again, realize that Breaking Bad never becomes Breaking Bad without, I believe, The Sopranos becoming a successful hit first. All of these shows, by the way, that I talk about, not on network television. So you had to pay to watch. And so if I, just for example, Breaking Bad, it says, let me see if I have a number here. I don't have the number here in front of me. Basically, the thing about Breaking Bad that was interesting is that it essentially came along on AMC, again, in that era where it was word of mouth. It was not very highly rated its first couple of seasons, but as people started to watch it and catch up and start watching it on other, either downloading it or watching it on, like a Netflix, for example, it's just become more popular. So it's really interesting. All right, well, let's move on because I know we've talked a lot about stuff here in this TV chapter. It is a big chapter, I agree. All right, how about network news? Okay, our daily news culture, as the book describes it. For about 40 years, from the 1960s to the 2000s, broadcast news, especially on local TV stations, consistently topped print journalism and national research polls that asked which news medium was most trustworthy. We're going to talk a lot about trust in journalism when we get to journalism, by the way. It's pretty shaky right now. Most studies at the time suggested this had to do with TV's intimacy as a medium, its ability to create loyalty with viewers who connect personally with news anchors that we invite into our homes, right? And print reporters and editors, you never see them, right? But you see someone on television and you kind of identify with them, right? But the distinction began breaking down between print reporters and broadcast reporters as cable programs started coming up. And obviously, you started to see a lot of these news programs start to kind of dive into, into more in-depth stuff when it comes to news. And of course, today, we spend a lot of our time getting our news, not so much from television, but actually from the web. And, we'll talk a lot about that when we get to journalism. But backing up, daily evening newscast, the first news program was NBC's Meet the Press in 1947. It was on NBC, still on the air today. That's on Sundays, by the way, Sunday morning, if you care. Daily evening newscast began in 1948. Walter Cronkite, an iconic figure in broadcast journalism, began broadcasting in 1962 for CBS. His famous, he was so famous for so many iconic moments in history, like the Kennedy assassination, the moonwalk in 1968. And he really cemented the idea that the network news anchor is cemented into American culture. And I think think about it today, we don't watch a lot of network news anymore. We just don't. They're still on the air. But I challenge you to think about a network news anchor that you can think of. Network news. I'm sure you probably know your cable people. You probably heard of Anderson Cooper, for example, Brett Baer at Fox News, maybe Lester Holt at MSNBC or NBC. But beyond that, my guess is you might have a more identification with someone that's local on local news. Well, another big thing that came up during this time in terms of news was 60 Minutes. It was created in 1968 by Don Hewitt, who basically had the famous line, "Tell me a story." Don Hewitt created 60 Minutes, basically this concept that taking the idea of a local or a network news broadcast where you would have 30 seconds to maybe 2 minutes to tell a story. Well, 60 Minutes would highlight maybe 3 stories in an hour. So each story getting anywhere between 14 to 16 minutes of actual story time. And it really combined the notion of like the documentary into, kind of the short form of broadcast journalism. And so it is the gold standard for, I think, storytelling, for journalistic storytelling. And it's been on the air since 1968. It's on Sunday nights at 7 o'clock. Out here on the West Coast, or is it 8 o'clock? Sorry, let me think. 7 o'clock on the West Coast. It's usually right after football. No, it'd be 8 o'clock, right? I get confused these days. Sorry, guys. In any event, it's 7 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. and it, 60 Minutes covers everything from, like, they'll talk about what's happening in Ukraine. They'll talk about what's happening with COVID-19, and they'll also do an extended feature on like a Taylor Swift or, some kind of celebrity that's in the news. So it's very interesting. But that link right there that I'd like you to click on, if you want to watch it now or watch it after this lecture's over, is all about the guys from South Park. South Park, that animated series on Comedy Central. It talks about their development. It's an older story, but it's still good. They actually were featured on 60 Minutes when they had just won a Tony Award for their play Book of Mormon. And it talks about the process of, well, first of all, it talks about how the guys got started. It talks about how they get a show together, and that show, South Park, is still on the air today. And one of the interesting things it talks about is that they go places with satire that are you simply can't do anymore in 2022, because we're such a sensitive nation now in terms of being offended by everything. Well, the South Park guys, I really respect them because they actually still go places with comedy that, quite frankly, a lot of other comedians and certainly network and entertainment programming doesn't. So anyway, take a look at it. I think you'll enjoy it, and there will be questions likely on a future test. So any of these links that you're looking at will definitely be part of the game. All right, last but not least with news is cable news. The first cable news channel was CNN. That came along in the early 80s. It created this idea of CNN Headline News was another network that was an offshoot of CNN. It created a 24/7 news cycle. Soon after that was Fox News Channel, then it was MSNBC. Of course, now a lot of our cable news, or a lot of our news, I should say, has moved over to social media platforms. So we're going to talk a lot about these things when we get to journalism. All right, we continue on, though, our look here. Reality TV and other enduring trends. Okay, dramas, comedies, and news are some of the longest standing TV genres, but others have played major roles in the medium's history, including talk shows, game shows, variety shows, news magazines. Reality-based programs are the newest significant trend. They include everything from The Voice to Deadliest Catch to Top Chef to Teen Mom, right? Obviously, the thing you're looking at there is Survivor. Amazing Race is another example. Bachelor in Paradise. These are all quote unquote reality television. Now, what makes them so appealing to a network to run? Well, for one thing, the network can own the show. The network doesn't have to spend $15 million per episode to put these things on the air, because they simply can literally focus their resources on the technical side. And, if they pay the person who wins the show $2 million or $1 million, right, that's still a fraction of what, for example, a network show would pay. So if, like, take Friends as an example, Friends was, just actor salaries alone was somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 million for every episode. That's how much they were paying. I'm sorry, not 20 million. They were getting paid $1 million an episode, right? For each of those guys in the late 90s. There were 6 major characters. That's $6 million. 6 million times 22 episodes is 132 million just for actors' salaries, just for those 6. So obviously paying someone $1 million or $2 million to win it all is a fraction of the cost. Now, there's a reason reality television came along in the first place. Back at the turn of the century, there was a massive writer's strike. And when that happened, networks went looking for content because they didn't have any original content to put on the air for several months, because the writers weren't producing, the writers weren't working, and it basically shut down Hollywood. Well, they turned to, Europe, which had Survivor, I believe, was a Swedish-based show, and they basically essentially adjusted it to an American audience. It became highly successful, and it, believe it or not, is still on the air 22 years later. Click on that link. I think you'll find it fascinating to see how they actually shoot these things, because, they go off to, like, Fiji, for example, and they've got this entire crew out there, and they spend, the better part of anywhere from 6 to 10 weeks out there on location shooting these shows, and they're highly successful. So, and of course, Spanish language television, right? As our demographics have changed in the US, and more and more people have, obviously immigrated from Latin America, from Mexico, Central America, et cetera. And we have more Spanish speakers in this country. The notion of having a Spanish, having programming based for Spanish language folks, or Spanish speaking folks, I should say, absolutely critical. All right. Also, PBS, public television, right? Public Broadcasting Act in 1967 leads to the establishment of PBS. It targeted viewers that were less attractive to commercial networks. Some problems, though, as of late. Obviously, there was a terrific need in order to to stay in kind of business, if you will. PBS was relying on not just government funding, but also corporate underwriting. So like a company like Texaco or Standard Oil, or I don't know, whatever, just take a big corporation. They would underwrite a lot of these shows like Ken Burns, these infamous Ken Burns documentaries that used to air on PBS, right? But in more recent times, a lot of what PBS is known for, documentaries, really kind of like what I call high culture television, has also moved to streaming networks as well. So I don't think we have as much of a reliance on public broadcasting as we once had, and not to mention a lot of the things that in my youth of watching Sesame Street and Elmo and all these other, kids shows, which you can watch on PBS still, you can also find on YouTube, right? So very much a struggle for PBS these days. Swinging back to economics for a bit here, 80% of consumers say that TV advertising of all ad formats is the most influential. So there's a reason why television is still kind of a big deal. You can see global television advertising revenue from 2015 to 24 in billions, right? Essentially we're spending about $160 billion a year in advertising globally for television. So it's still a big dog. The average cost of an ad in primetime TV, $104,000 in 2022. It has really diminished over time. And that is a reflection of the fact that primetime television, ABC, NBC, CBS, far less of an audience than it used to be. Less of an audience means you cannot charge for as much, company to advertise on your show. Local TV advertisers can expect to pay $5 per 1,000 viewers. So if you live in a smaller market, obviously, if you're a local business or a company, it is a lot cheaper to advertise in a much smaller market, but your reach is much smaller as well, correct? Because obviously we have 20 plus million people here in LA. And in my first job in TV, which was Scotts Bluff, I think the entire community was like 15,000 people. Massive difference. There are two types of production costs, okay? Fall into two categories, above the line and below the line. Below the line or hardware costs account for 40% of a new program's production budget. This includes includes equipment, cameras, lighting, special effects, crew sets, carpenters, electricians, etc. Above the line or software costs include creative talent, actors, writers, producers, editors, and directors. This accounts for 60% of a program's budget, but it can go higher when a series becomes more popular and actors are paid more. Certainly The Crown is an example of that. Certainly Friends back in the 90s was an example of that. Game of Thrones, even Breaking Bad, all of it at some point becomes cost prohibitive to continue on, or if anything, maybe becomes, a lot of shows like to get out when creatively they don't feel like they're just sort of putting it on the air just to print money. Okay. Most primetime programs are developed by independent production companies that are owned or backed by major film studios such as Sony or Disney. Film studios function as a bank offering capital to producers through one or more seasons. Because of smaller audiences and fewer episodes per seasons, costs for original programming on cable are lower than those for network broadcasts. We talked about at the very beginning in part one how much these things cost. For example, The Crown, $130 million per season. All right. Anyway, Syndication, okay? So syndication is basically defined by two different forms of syndication. There's one called off-network syndication, which is essentially a show that has been on the air on television or cable that later then goes into reruns on a different network, right? It is, and these shows, like Friends, for example, right, which was initially an NBC show, now run on all sorts of different affiliates all over the country. They don't necessarily have to be NBC. And so basically, you have cable service providers like Time Warner Cable, right, rely mostly on customer subscriptions to pay for distributing their channels, but they also have to pay the broadcast networks retransmission fees to carry network channels, right? And oftentimes these channels will then be, good ground for syndication, all right? So in many ways, leasing TV stations or cable networks have the exclusive rights to air TV shows, right? And then when they distribute, they basically then go sell these shows to these various affiliates around the country. And, and then they will renegotiate these contracts every couple of years. And what's cool about this is for people that are involved in a show like Friends, which earn $1 billion in off-network syndication, is if you're involved in Friends, you get residuals every time that show either airs or at least is sold to an affiliate around the country. And so these contracts are negotiated constantly. Obviously, they diminish over time. But the fact is that these are cash cows. So I think the magic number, if you will, is somewhere in the 60s for if you make over 60 episodes, that's basically when you're eligible for off-network syndication. I encourage you to read more about syndication, not just in the textbook, but maybe Google it to have a better understanding. It's a hard concept to explain. But there's also first-run syndication, which is like Wheel of Fortune, the Ellen DeGeneres show when it was on the air, Jeopardy, right? That is first-run syndication, and basically these are shows that were never on a particular network per se, but are created specifically to be sold to affiliates all over the country. And affiliates, by the way, what I mean by that is, let's say you're in Midland, Texas. Generally, whether it's off network or first run, these shows are going to only air on one particular station in that market. And those stations often spend time bidding to get those shows because they know that they can sell pretty good advertising within these shows to make money back. First, obviously, to pay for the cost of the syndicating it, but also to make money for the particular station. So hopefully that makes sense. All right. Anyway, what else can I tell you here? Let's go here. Measuring television audience, right? Ratings and shares. We've talked about this in radio. Ratings are basically networks. Let me back up for a second. Networks have tracked primetime viewing since 1950 and how to set advertising rates. So audience size is a direct correlation to how much you can charge, or size of audience is directly correlated to how much you can charge for advertising. The Nielsen Corporation estimates what viewers are watching in the nation's major markets and then provides advertisers, broadcast networks, local stations, and cable channels with considerable details about viewers, from race and gender to age, occupation, and educational background. These all matter very much when you're an advertiser, because you obviously want to connect your, you want as an advertiser, you want to connect your product to a audience that is going to buy it, right? So, you're not going to basically sell, I would say, like beer. Beer is very popular on a sporting event or when we're watching a sporting event, but I really couldn't see beer being like a good investment, right? If you're watching a, Saturday morning cartoon, it doesn't make sense, right? Because kids don't drink, right? So how do they determine how big this audience is? Well, they do it by rating and share. Rating equal a percentage of households which are tuned to a program, versus share, which is percentage of homes turned to a certain program with those simply using their sets at a time of the sample, okay? So that's how you do it. Ratings are based on a percentage of households tuned to a sampled program. Shares are based on a percentage of homes tuned to a program compared with those actually using their sets at the time of sample. All right. And of course, convergence, clearly changing how TV viewing is being measured these days, because we measure it now in downloads, not necessarily how many people are quote unquote tuning in. All right. Television, cable, and democracy, right? In its heyday, television carried the promise it could reach all segments of society, okay? And it was fairly straightforward. Convergence, though, potentially de-emphasizes the idea we're all citizens who are part of a larger nation and world. In many ways, we seek out things in convergence. We seek out what we want to watch. We seek out what we want to read about. We are very, I use the term somewhat tribal. We become more tribal because of social media. Social media has also obviously fingered its way into content creation. We're very much, we very much can stay in our lane because of convergence. And it also means that way in television as well. It can mean what news programs we watch. It can be what we decide to watch from a show standpoint, with whatever the content is, whatever the messaging is, right? But the fact is that TV rather is still a gathering place for friends and family, and in the future will be about serving smaller rather than larger audiences, more niche. And although niche is good, niche is also dysfunctional in the fact, like I said, that niche can also mean that we don't spend a lot of time broadening our horizons. So something to chew on there as I wrap up our lecture on television. Of course, film will be next, but again, please do me the favor and the courtesy of making sure that you click on all the links that are on YouTube that were used in this lecture from top to bottom. I think you'll find them very interesting and enlightening. If there's something that I didn't explain very well, by all means, feel free to open up the textbook and get further clarification. And if I can help, you can always reach out to me via email. So until next time, I will see you when we get to film. Bye-bye.